Welcome to Vices and Volumes. I'm your host, Davil Clinton Ford, and in this episode, we're exploring the Victorian gentleman at his most tedious. Ladies were being instructed never to mention themselves, while gentlemen held forth about their own achievements for hours on end. We'll meet Lord Erskine so consumed by self-regard that he asked what the great orator Grattan said of himself, prompting one of history's most cutting responses. We'll encounter the American who wouldn't stop interrogating a stranger until he discovered why the man had never seen his own children. We'll witness Alexandre Dumas trace his pedigree back to the apes to silence a racist. And we'll discover why brilliant writers like Addison and Goldsmith couldn't speak in company while mediocrites droned on about aqueous fluids trickling from visual organs. From egotists to Pleonasts, from literary lions who couldn't roar to the rare man who actually knew how to listen. This is the Victorian talker in all his self-absorbed and occasionally magnificent glory. Before I begin, if you love the podcast and you'd like to help support me, I have a Ko-fi account which allows you to donate the price of a coffee to me, which supports the software, the equipment and the books that I use, and it allows me to continue the podcast for as long as possible as I can without advertising. I'll add this to the show notes as well, but it'll also be in my socials, which are Vices and Volumes everywhere. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube and Threads. Please follow me for any updates, news, interesting content and comment. Let me know what you think of the podcast and join the conversation. So this particular podcast was inspired by some articles in the Chambers Edinburgh Journal from 1845 and 1878. I have the 1845 copy here. So if you're watching on Spotify and YouTube, you can have a look at this. This one is gorgeous. It's got this lovely, amazing gold spine on it. You can really see how fabulous this is. But the inside of these books is interesting. It is literally just text. There's so much content in it and it is really enjoyable to read. I love the heading on this one. And I also took this from the 1878 copy as well, which is a little bit heavier. Oh. And it is fabulously bound in this. It's got this lovely green, but what I love is this calf skin leather spine on it. It is so soft and so gorgeous, and in this gorgeous tan leather. The design changed a little bit over the years, and you can see that the heading, the title for all the pages is a little bit different, but overall it's pretty much the same. And then finally, I have a Mrs. Beeton. I love to get Mrs. Beeton in the conversation when it comes to things like this. And this is the complete etiquette for ladies. The advertising in this is cool. I love the pages here. So the Chambers Edinburgh Journal was founded in 1832 by the brothers William and Robert Chambers in Edinburgh, aimed at providing affordable educational content to the rising middle classes. By the 1840s, according to historian Aileen Fife in Science and Salvation 2004, it had a circulation exceeding 80,000 copies, which is remarkable for the period. The journal published essays, stories, articles on science and history and social improvement. I kind of love it because it reminds me of an Instagram feed. It also has things about, walking and then, having your dog or what vegetables you should eat. It's a great book for that feeling of the times. And it was considered very respectable, very enlightening and thoroughly proper reading for the whole family. Which makes it a rather telling that it is articles on conversation are essentially catalogues of masculine failure. In the 1846 article on conversation, it opens what sounds like praise. The art of conversation is generally considered to be something so easy of attainment, so natural a consequence, that gift or rational speech, which distinguishes man from the rest of creation, that a few persons take any trouble to prepare themselves for its practice. The assumption is that conversation should be effortless. Speech is natural to humans, therefore good conversation must follow naturally. Except it doesn't. The article continues. Perhaps this is the reason why, when we recall conversations in which we have taken a part, we generally find that but a small amount either of pleasure or improvement had been obtained from them. Conversations are disappointing. This is the starting premise. Not some conversations, not conversations with certain people, just conversations generally. The default expectation is tedium. The article draws on Bacon to describe people with certain commonplaces wherein there are good but want of variety. Which kind of poverty is the most part tedious and ridiculous? Tedious and ridiculous. This is the charitable assessment of most conversationalists. They have a few topics that they've learned to discuss passably well, and they'll return to them obsessively, regardless of context or interest. Peter Burke in The Art of Conversation 1993 argues that 18th and 19th century British society placed enormous value on conversational skills as a marker of gentlemanly accomplishment. Clubs and coffee houses and salons were spaces where reputations were made or destroyed based on one's ability to talk well. Yet, Burke notes actual conversation skill was rare. Most men fell into predictable patterns, the same topics, the same opinions, the same stories, the performance of conversation rather than a genuine exchange. According to Rochefoucauld, whose maxims the Chambers article quotes, one reason why we meet so few persons who are reasonable and agreeable in conversation is that there is scarce anyone who does not think more of what he has to say than of answering what is said to him. Even those who have the most address and politeness think they do enough if they only seem attentive. At the same time, their eyes and their minds betray a distraction as to what is addressed to them and an impatience to return to what they themselves are saying. No one is listening. Everyone is simply waiting for their turn to speak. Visibly impatient, barely maintaining fiction of attention, Rochefoucauld wrote this in the 17th century, and in a 19th century journal, it is confirming it remains accurate, and I would say it remains accurate today in some cases. 2 centuries of conversation failure, still in continuation today. Emerson provides the American perspective. That happens in the world which we often witness in a public debate. Each of the speakers expresses himself imperfectly. No one of them hears much that the other says. Such is the preoccupation of the mind of each, and the audience, who have only to hear and not to speak, judge very wisely how wrong-headed and unskillful is each of the debaters to his own affairs. The debaters don't hear each other. The audience can see it clearly. Everyone is performing monologues across purposes. James Eli Adams in Dandies and Desert Saints, Styles of Victorian Masculinity, 1995, identifies masculine conversation in clubs and public spaces as fundamentally competitive. Men were establishing dominance, displaying knowledge, asserting authority. Listening was a weakness, and conceding a point was defeat. Every conversation was a battle for conversational supremacy. This explains rather a lot about why conversations were so disappointing. In the 1878 Chambers article on talkers, acknowledges the problem directly. Who does not like to hear a really good talker, whether in the public room or private circle? Immediately followed by, yet it must be acknowledged that the silent man, as a rule, at a great disadvantage compared to his neighbour who can use his tongue well and is, as the phrase goes, good company. But how comparatively few are the talkers with whom we can find no fault. Sometimes some are too egotistical and others censorious. The silent man is at a disadvantage, despite the fact that most talkers are insufferable. Better to be tedious than quiet, apparently. The taxonomy of terrible talkers begins with egotists, and the article provides a wonderful specimen. "I was to dine with the Admiral tonight," said a naval lieutenant once, "but I have so many invitations elsewhere that I can't go." "I'm going, and I'll apologise," said a brother officer. "Oh, don't trouble yourself." "But I must," said the officer, "for the Admiral's invitation, like that of the Queen, is a command." "Never mind, pray don't mention my name," rejoined the lieutenant. "For your own sake, I certainly will," was the reply. At length the hero of 100 cards stammered out, "Don't say a word about it. I had a hint to stay away." "A hint to stay away? Why so?" "The fact is, I wasn't invited." The entire fabrication about too many invitations was designed to make himself seem important. His fellow officer systematically dismantled the fiction by insisting on apologising, forcing the lieutenant to admit he'd never been invited at all. The phrase, "a hero of 100 cards," is particularly cutting. He styled himself overwhelmed with social obligations while actually being overlooked. The article continues. "Egotists are an intolerable set of bores. Everything they say is interlaid with I. It is I throughout. Into all conversations they drag allusions to themselves." This brings us to Lord Erskine, Thomas Erskine, the first Baron of Erskine, one of the most brilliant barristers in English legal history. He was born in 1750 and he had brief careers in the Royal Navy and the British Army before becoming a lawyer. He defended radicals including Thomas Paine and Lord George Gordon, and according to legal historian John Hollister in Thomas Erskine and Trial by Jury 2010, his defence speeches were considered masterpieces of legal oratory. His final notable case was defending Queen Caroline at her divorce in 1820. James Boswell recorded that when Erskine met Dr. Johnson as a young officer, he talked with a vivacity and fluency and precision so uncommon that he attracted particular attention. Genuinely gifted with words, but genuinely incapable of using them without referencing himself. Lord Erskine was a great egotist. One day in conversation with Curran, he casually asked what Grattan said of himself. Henry Grattan was one of the greatest Irish orators, champion of Irish legislative independence, revered in Ireland as the voice of parliamentary reform. Erskine assumed that as a great man he would talk about himself and his accomplishments and triumphs. John Philpot Curran, himself one of Ireland's most brilliant barristers and orators, responds to Erskine. "Said of himself," was Curran's astonished reply, "nothing. Grattan speak of himself. Why, sir, Grattan is a great man. Sir, torture could not wring a syllable of self-praise from Grattan. A team of 6 horses could not drag an opinion of himself out of him. Like all great men, he knows the strength of his reputation and never concede to proclaim its march like the trumpeter of a puppet show. Sir, he stands on a national altar and is the business of us inferior men to keep up the fire and incense. You will never see Grattan stooping to do either the one or the other." Torture and 6 horses, these are the metaphors required to express how utterly foreign self-praise was to Grattan. He stands on a national altar. It is everyone else's job to maintain the worship. He would never stoop to doing it himself. What's worth noting is that this was exceptional behaviour and extraordinary for that time. Grattan's refusal to mention himself was so unusual it defined his greatness in Curran's telling. For women, never mentioning themselves was basic femininity, the absolute minimum requirement for acceptable behaviour. But for men, it marked extraordinary character. Erskine could have an entire career of brilliant legal work while boring everyone about himself, and Grattan's achievement was doing the same work while maintaining silence about his own accomplishments. One was a character flaw mildly amusing, and the other was evidence of moral superiority worthy of veneration. Curran had opinions on other egotists, on Byron's poetry. "Any subject," he said, "but that eternal one of self, I am weary of knowing periodically the state of any man's hopes or fears, rights or wrongs. I would as soon read the register of the weather, the barometer, up so many inches today and down so many inches tomorrow. I feel scepticism all over me at the sight of agonies on paper. These things that come as regular and notorious as the full moon." Byron's confessional style was wildly popular, commercially successful, critically acclaimed, struck Curran as tedious. Scheduled suffering, predictable emotional displays as routine as lunar cycles, he saw that Byron was simply talking about being a human and making a big deal of that mundane fact through poetry. Andrew Elfenben notes in Byron and the Victorians 1995 that Byron's self-referential poetry was controversial precisely because it made the poet's personal life the constant subject. Critics accused him of narcissism and emotional exhibitionism. Curran simply found it boring. The curious thing is that none of this stopped their careers. Erskine continued to be celebrated. Byron remained enormously successful. Male egotism was a flaw, certainly, something to mock at dinner parties, something to complain about in journals, but never a disqualification from public life, professional success, or social standing. But now we turn to the Inquisitor, and Chambers has found an American specimen. The article explains. "A genuine Yankee in San Francisco had bored a newcomer with every conceivable question relative to his object in visiting the Gold Country. His hopes, his means, his prospects. At length he asked him if he had a family. 'Yes, sir, I have a wife and 6 children, and I never saw one of them.' After this reply, the couple sat a few minutes in silence, and then the interrogator again commented, "Was you ever blind, sir?" "No, sir." "Did you marry a widow, sir?" "No, sir." Another interval of silence. "Did I understand you to say, sir, that you had a wife and 6 children living in New York and had never seen one of them?" "Yes, sir, I so stated it." Another long pause. Then the interrogator again inquired, "How can it be, sir, that you never saw one of them?" "Why," was the response, "one of them was born after I left." This is a rather brilliant revenge. The newcomer has been subjected to relentless questioning, so he constructs a puzzle specifically designed to torment his interrogator. The Yankee can't help himself. He must solve it. He cycles through the possibilities, becoming more frustrated with each denial, and then finally the reveal: one child was born after he left New York. He'd seen the other 5. Simple enough once you know the answer, but maddening if you're the one who kept demanding the information. Richard Bushman, in The Refinement of America, Persons, Houses and Cities in 1992, documents that Americans were notorious in British eyes for being overly familiar and inquisitive. British reserve demanded that personal questions be avoided. Americans kept asking everything immediately. The cultural difference wasn't subtle. British travellers consistently complained about American invasiveness, whilst Americans found British reserve cold and unfriendly. What the British called good breeding, the Americans called snobbery. What Americans call friendliness, the British called impertinence. Chambers notes hopefully, "We are not told to what country the individual belonged, who got so well matched in the following story, but we will hope that he was not English or Scotch." Then we meet Alexandre Dumas, a person more remarkable for inquisitiveness than good breeding, one of those who, devoid of delicacy and reckless of rebuff, pry into everything, took the liberty to question Alexandre Dumas rather closely concerning his genealogical tree. "I am a quadroon, Mr. Dumas," he began. "Yes," replied Mr. Dumas, who had seen enough not to be ashamed of a descent that he could not conceal. "And your father?" "Was a mulatto." "And your grandfather?" "A Negro," hastily answered the dramatist, whose patience was waning. "And may I inquire to what your great-grandfather was?" "An ape, sir," thundered Dumas, with a fierceness that made his impertinent interrogator shrink into the smallest possible compass. "An ape, sir, my pedigree commences where yours terminates." Alexandre Dumas, author of The Three Musketeers and Count of Monte Cristo, one of France's most commercially successful writers, faced racism his entire life. His grandfather was a French nobleman who owned a plantation. His grandmother was Marie Cassette Dumas, an enslaved woman of African descent. When his grandfather returned to France to claim an inheritance, he sold Marie Cassette and her other children to pay for passage, but kept his son, Thomas Alexandre. Tom Rees's documents in The Black Count, Glory, Revolution, Betrayal and The Real Count of Monte Cristo, 2012, that Thomas Alexandre Dumas became the highest-ranking black general in the French Revolutionary Army, nicknamed the Black Hercules. A genuine military hero, the surname Dumas came from Alexander's enslaved grandmother, believed to mean of the farm, a reference to her status as property. Someone is interrogating him about his ancestry, as though tracing his genealogical tree will reveal something shameful. Dumas responds by claiming it completely and turning it into an annihilation. Yes, his great-grandfather was an ape. His pedigree starts where the racist ends. The racist pedigree presumably terminates with apes, as all pedigrees do, if you go back far enough. Dumas begins there and ascends to glory. Military heroism, literary genius, commercial success. The interrogator has walked directly into being called an ape, while Dumas claims evolutionary superiority. Laura Jarman notes in Wishbone, Reference and Interpretation in Black Folk Narrative, 2003, that Dumas used his mixed-race identity throughout his work, particularly in the 1843 novel Georges, which dealt explicitly with racial prejudice. He didn't hide his ancestry, he weaponized it. Anyone who thought it diminished him discovered otherwise, usually through public humiliation. The interrogator shrank into the smallest possible compass, entirely destroyed by his own question. Next comes the Pleonast, someone who uses far too many words for simple ideas. Chambers provides 2 examples. First, A Gentleman and Happiness. I sought for happiness where it could not be found. I looked for felicity where it could not be discovered. I inquired after bliss in those places, situations, and circumstances where neither bliss nor felicity nor happiness ever visited. Thus I remained with little change and continued without much alteration all through the days of my youth, the years of my juvenility, and the period of my adolescence. Is that really your experience? Said one who was listening. And do you intend that as a caution to us against seeking happiness in the same way? Most positively and assuredly I do. Profoundly impressed with the veracity of these sentiments, deeply sensible in their correctness, and heartily persuaded and assured and convinced of their consonance with truth. I urge and press upon your attention that I have above and beyond couched and expressed in such a simple and plain and intelligible language, and language easily understood withal. Happiness, felicity, bliss, sought, looked for, inquired after, youth, juvenility, adolescence, positively assured, profoundly impressed, deeply sensible, heartily persuaded, assured, convinced. Every concept requires multiple synonyms. Nothing is said once, it can be said 5 times with slight variations. He describes this verbal diarrhea as simple and plain, intelligible language, and language easily to be understood withal. 4 different ways to say simple language while demonstrating the complete opposite. Adam Pockey argues in The Fate of Eloquence in the Age of Hume, 2016, that 18th and 19th century oratory often prized elaboration and repetition of evidence of learning. Classical rhetoric taught variation and amplification. There was meant to be a line between eloquence and absurdity, and of course the Pleonast had crossed it enthusiastically. The second example, another of these talkers who encumbered their ideas with such a plethora of words was once speaking of a man who was found drowned in a canal in the neighbourhood where he lived, and expressed himself thus: he is supposed to have perpetrated, committed, and done voluntarily, willingly, and of himself, destruction, suicide, and drowning, while in a mood of mental aberration, superinduced, brought about and effected by long indulgence and continued habits of inhaling, drinking, and swallowing to inebriation and drunkenness intoxicating fluids. The man died drowning while drunk. That's the actual information, but perpetrated, committed, and done voluntarily, willingly, and of himself, destruction, suicide, and drowning, mental aberration, superinduced, brought about and effected inhaling, drinking, swallowing, inebriation, and drunkenness. Every verb tripled, every concept elaborated into redundancy. Chambers admits these specimens are only exaggerations, for it is difficult to believe that anyone would speak with such a ridiculous fashion. Yet, the exaggeration captures something true about the certain style of speaker. Someone who mistakes verbosity for eloquence, who believes the more words demonstrate greater thought, who cannot resist expanding every sentiment into baroque elaboration. Now, the double-tongued talker follows, Miss Horton to Miss Shenstone. What darling little cherubs your twins are. I really should be proud of them if they were mine. Such lovely eyes, such rosy cheeks, etc. And adding, dear darlings, come and kiss me. Miss Shenstone smiled complacently in return and shortly after retired from the room, where the 2 little cherubs approached their prodigious admirer with a view to make friends and press upon her the solicited kiss. Instantly, however, she put them at arm's length from her, saying to the lady who sat next to her, what pests these little things are, treading on my dress and obtruding their presence on me like this. I do wish Miss Shenstone had taken them out of the room with her. Darling cherubs to the mother's face, and pests the moment she leaves. The children heard themselves praised and were encouraged to approach for a kiss, and are now being physically pushed away and insulted. Lenore Davidoff documents the best circles in 1973 that Victorian social life required constant performance of sentiments one didn't feel. Politeness demanded praising things you disliked, expressing interest you lacked, and maintaining fictions everyone knew were false. Skilled practitioners managed that seamlessly, but Miss Horton had failed at even basic hypocrisy management by contradicting herself within minutes whilst the evidence of her lie stands directly in front of her. Now the grandiloquent speakers, people who are pompous or overbearing in their delivery. A minister described a tear as that small particle of aqueous fluid trickling from the visual organ over the lineaments of the countenance, betokening grief. A tear requires 17 words, where one will do. Why settle for simplicity when you construct Baroque absurdity? Callum Brown notes in The Death of Christian Britain 2001 that Victorian sermons often employed elevated, elaborate language. Simplicity was suspect. Biblical truths required grandiloquent expressions to match their importance. Some ministers developed an addiction to this style, incapable of expressing anything simply once they discovered the pleasures of aqueous fluid and visual organs. Another minister, speaking about a young men's Christian association, revealed himself in the following manner. When I think of this organisation with its complex powers, it reminds me of some stupendous mechanism which shall spin electric bands of stupendous thought and feeling, illuminating the vista of eternity with coruscations of brilliancy and binding the mystic brow of eternal ages with a tiara of never-dying beauty. Whilst for most of those who have trampled on the truth of Christ, it shall spin from its terrible form toils of eternal funeral bands, darker and darker, till sunk into the lowest abyss of destiny. A Young Men's Christian Association, young men meeting for prayer and moral improvement, electric bands of stupendous thought, coruscations of brilliancy. The lowest abyss of destiny. It's a little unhinged, possibly quite compelling and effective if performed with sufficient conviction. An American on liberty? White-robed liberty sits upon her rosy clouds above us. The genius of our country, standing on her throne of mountains, bids her eagle standard-bearer wind his spiral course full in the sun's proud eye, while the genius of Christianity, surrounded by 10,000 cherubim and seraphim, moves the panorama of the milky clouds above us and floats immortal fragrance, the very aroma of Eden, through all the atmosphere. I don't know about you, but I haven't a clue what he's talking about. Kenneth Kamel documents in Democratic Eloquence, the fight over popular speech in 19th century America in 1990, that American oratory in the 19th century embraced grandiloquence as a patriotic expression. Elaborate metaphors and elevated language demonstrated worthiness of democratic participation. British observers found it overblown and absurd. Americans found British restraint cold and unpatriotic. Cultural differences in acceptable verbal excess. Now, we turn to literary men who couldn't talk at all. The 1846 Chambers article addresses this directly. William Hazlitt believed that actors and authors were not fitted, generally speaking, to shine in conversation. Authors ought to be read and not heard, and as to actors, they could not speak tragedies in the drawing room, and their wit was likely to be comedy and farce at second hand. The article continues. The biography of men of letters in a great measure confirms this opinion. Some of the greatest names in English and French literature, men who have filled books with an eloquence and truth that defy oblivion, were mere mutes before their fellow men. Descartes, La Fontaine, and Buffon were all singularly deficient in the powers of conversation, giants of French intellectual life, terrible in person. Marmontel, the novelist, was so dull that his friends said of him after an interview, "I must go and read his tales to recompense myself for the weariness of hearing him." You had to read his books to recover from meeting him. Cornell was so completely lost in society, so absent and embarrassed, that he wrote himself a witty couplet, implying that he was never intelligible but through the mouth of another. Francis, greatest dramatist, couldn't deliver his own dialogue. He needed actors. Charles II caused himself to be introduced in the character of a private gentleman to Butler, its author, after being charmed by Hudibras. The witty king found the author a very dull companion, and was of opinion, with many others, that so stupid a fellow could never have written such clever books. Samuel Butler wrote one of the wittiest satires in English literature. In person, according to Nicholas McDowell in Poetry and Elegance of the English Civil Wars 2008, he was awkward and unable to perform the wit he captured on paper. The gap between written brilliance and social competence could be absolute. Joseph Addison whose classic elegance of style has long been considered the best model for young writers, was shy and absent in society, preserving even before a single stranger a stiff and dignified silence. One of the founders of modern English prose style could not speak in company. He was accustomed to say that there could be no real conversation but between two persons, friends, and that it was then thinking aloud. Only intimate friends, only one-on-one, otherwise silence. Yet those who knew him well disagreed. Steele, Swift, Pope, Congreve allowed him to have been a delightful companion amongst inmates, and Young wrote that when he began to be company, he was in full vivacity and went on in a noble strain of thought and language, so as to chain the attention of everyone to him. Addison could talk brilliantly, apparently, when comfortable with the people he trusted, otherwise mute. Oliver Goldsmith presented a different problem. Appeared in company to have no spark of that genius which shone so brightly in his works. His address was awkward, his manner uncouth, his language unpolished, and he hesitated in speaking, and was always unhappy if the conversation did not turn upon himself. Brilliant writer, terrible conversationalist, awkward, uncouth, unpolished, hesitant, unhappy unless he was talking about himself, combining the worst of both worlds, apparently unable to speak well, and yet demanding the subject to be him. Dr. Johnson called him an inspired idiot. The inspiration was genuine, but only on paper. Even Johnson, though delivering oracles to those around him in pompous phrases which have been happily described as spoken in the Johnsonese tongue, was not entitled to be called a good conversationer. Leo Damrosch argues, the club Johnson, Boswell and Friends, who shaped the age in 2019, that Johnson dominated conversation through force of personality and opinion. He crushed opposition, pronounced judgments, expected deference. This made him memorable and quotable, Boswell recorded for posterity. It did not make him a good conversationalist. Conversation requires listening, responding, genuine exchange. Johnson monologued. Coleridge was another monologuer, in the habit of pouring forth brilliant and unbroken monologues of 2 or 3 hours' duration to listeners so enchanted that, like Adam, whose ears were filled with the eloquence of an archangel, they forgot all place, all seasons and their change. But this was not conversation. 2 or 3 hours without interruption. Richard Holmes documents in Coleridge Dark Reflections 1998 that Coleridge's monologues were legendary. Philosophy, poetry, theology, personal reflection, woven together in streams of extraordinary eloquence. But no one else could speak. It was a performance, not an exchange. What did actual good conversation look like? Washington Irving visited Walter Scott at Abbotsford and recorded. He says of Sir Walter Scott that he acted for the moment, not for the study, but from feeling, never betraying any effort or straining for effect, letting his thoughts break forth in picturesque detail, following natural, out of the subject, with the whole springing free and unimpedimently from the flow of his spirits, the stories of his memory and the vigour of his imagination. As good a listener as a talker. This is the distinction. Irving continues. No one's concerns, no one's pursuits and opinions, no one's tastes and pleasures seemed beneath him. He made himself so thoroughly the companion of those with whom he happened to be that they forgot, for a time, his vast superiority and only recollected and wondered, when all was over, that it was Scott with whom they had been on such familiar terms, and in whose society they had felt so perfectly at ease. People forgot his superiority. They felt comfortable. They only realised afterwards who they'd been talking with. John Sutherland notes in The Life of Walter Scott, 1995, that Scott's conversational gift was making others feel valued. He asked questions, listened to answers, drew people out. He did not dominate or display knowledge. This made him universally beloved, and even by literary rivals. What Scott practiced naturally was what women were forced to do by social requirement. In the 1878 Chambers article on good manners, it describes pleasant behaviour. Given a gentleman or lady with that ease of manner which must characterise such, a determination to try and feel, or at least appear interested in what is going on around, and to avoid, as far as conscience will allow, anything which may offend the prejudices of those whose company he or she may be in, and we have undoubtedly a well-mannered person. Appear interested. Avoid giving offence. Make an effort. These aren't profound requirements. The article identifies essential qualities as refinement of mind, that instinctive knowledge of what the effect of our words may be, that capability of putting oneself in the place of another. Imagining how your words will affect someone before speaking with them, Norbert Elias argues in Civilizing Process, 1939, that the development of empathy and self-monitoring was central to European court society and gradually spread to the middle classes. The ability to imagine others' perspectives and moderate behaviour accordingly became a marker of civility. For men, this was an optional refinement, evidence of superior character if present, a minor flaw if absent. For women, it was mandatory. Mrs. Beeton's Complete Etiquette for Ladies from 1892 makes this explicit. It is very discourteous when a person begins to relate a circumstance or an anecdote to stop them short by saying, "You have heard it before." Still worse to say, "If you do not wish to hear it at all." Don't interrupt men's stories, even if you've heard them before, even if they bore you. Generally speaking, it is injudicious for ladies to attempt arguing with gentlemen on political or financial topics. All the information that a woman can possibly acquire and remember on these subjects is so small in comparison with the knowledge of men that a discussion will not elevate them in the opinion of masculine minds. Women know nothing about serious topics. The discussion will not elevate them. Note the assumption that elevation in masculine opinion is the goal of the female conversation. Still, it is well for a woman to desire enlightenment, that she may comprehend something of these discussions when she hears them from the other sex, but let her refrain from controversy and argument on such topics as the grasp of the female mind is seldom capable of seizing or retaining. The grasp of the female mind is incapable of retaining serious information. Women should desire enlightenment, passive reception of knowledge from men, but never engage in actual discussion. Men are very intolerant towards women who are prone to contradiction and contention when the talk is of things considered out of their sphere, but very indulgent towards a modest and attractive listener who only asks questions for the sake of information. The implication is clear. Women should facilitate men's talking, not attempt to participate equally. Oh, the horror. Men like to dispense knowledge, but few of them believe that in departments exclusively their own, they can profit much by the suggestions of women. Men enjoy teaching. They don't believe women have anything valuable to contribute. So women should perform interest and gratitude while contributing nothing. Let's review. Men could be egotists like Erskine, droning on endlessly about themselves. They faced mockery, but never consequences. They could be inquisitors like the American Yankee, and they could be Pleonasts, giving 5 words where 1 will do. They could be terrible conversationalists, awkward like Goldsmith, silent like Addison, monopolising like Johnson and Coleridge. The consequences, perhaps the most telling detail, is Curran's description of Grattan. Torture could not wring self-praise from him. 6 horses could not drag an opinion of himself out of him. This was exceptional in a man. So exceptional, it defined his greatness. Women were required never to mention themselves as a basic femininity. For men, it marked extraordinary character. Bless them. The rules weren't different, the consequences, though, they were. We've come some distance in this world. Women can now argue about politics without being told that the grasp of the female mind is insufficient. Women can speak about their own achievements without committing social suicide. Yet, the patterns linger. Studies of workplace meetings consistently show men speaking more and being interrupted less. Women's contributions are often overlooked until a man repeats them. Women who assert themselves are described as aggressive, while identical male behaviour is called confident. The egotists are still with us. They are just called thought leaders now. The Pleonasts are writing emails that could have been 1 sentence. The Inquisitors are asking, "Where are you really from?" We've also inherited Walter Scott's model. Some people practice listening as much as talking. Some people make others feel valued. Some people imagine others' perspectives before speaking. It's no longer considered evidence of intellectual incapacity. That's progress, at least. Until next time, may your egotism never require a current to deflate it, may your pedigree never commence where another one's terminates, and may your aqueous fluids never trickle from your visual organs at tedious conversations. This has been Vices and Volumes. I'm Avril. Thank you for listening. Creating this podcast is a genuine joy for me, and knowing that you're out there listening and engaging with these stories makes it all worthwhile. If you haven't already, please subscribe to Vices and Volumes on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen, and consider leaving a rating or review. It truly helps the show. You can also follow along on Instagram, Facebook and TikTok at Vices and Volumes, or visit vicesandvolumes.wordpress.com for more information. And please reach out and let me know what you think. I love hearing from you. Thank you for being a part of this journey.